Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining me in another episode of the Three Things I Learned podcast. I am Chris Michaels. I'm your host. And today we've got a wonderful guest. She was joining us all the way from Toronto, Ontario, to tell us a few things that she's learned from living with a disability. Stay tuned. You are not going to want to miss this episode. Everybody, so there are a lot of things going on today. There's a lot of people in the world who think that they might have it easy. You might be walking around and think that you've gone through some troubles, but you probably don't have to deal with those troubles every day of your life. And somebody who's living with a disability typically has to overcome a lot of challenges day in and day out, whether it be a physical disability, a learning disability, a motor disability, a combination of multiple things. My guest today, Rosemary Richings, is joining us all the way from Toronto, Ontario. Rosie, thank you for being here with us today to talk a little bit about dyspraxia, which is a condition that you have. You there?
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show.
No problem. So thank you again for joining us. So now tell me a little bit, you've been somebody who's lived almost your entire life with, or at least at some point you were diagnosed with dyspraxia, but tell us and educate us, what is dyspraxia? What is the condition? And apparently there's a lot of people out there that have it.
Yeah, actually, people medically knowing about it is fairly recent, but it's always been a thing. So if the listeners are listening and what I'm describing sounds like some things that you've struggled with, chances are you might want to get tested as well. So dyspraxia basically relates to fine and gross motor skills. So examples of that would be everything from the thoughts that go through your head when you're driving a car to the thoughts that go through your head when you're doing like an arts and crafts activity, or you're riding a bike, or you're figuring out exactly what you have to do next in order to like pour a cup of coffee and not spill it always. That relates all to your fine and gross motor skills part of your brain. And also that relates to spatial processing, which plays into, so like processing complex directions, like or something like that. Like if someone says you need to go west on this or turn right or etc., it might take a little bit more time for figuring that out. And that's basically why my whole life, my way of coping with that when I have to navigate around all by myself is by just memorizing things as a picture. So instead of memorizing, like, they have to make a certain turn at a certain point, I would specifically remember that there would be like a tree that looks a certain way, or a house that looks a certain way, or whatever, in order to look at a specific location.
Right. I've heard some people describe it as a condition where your brain really has no sense of like place and time, like being able to merge the two things. There was a blogger in doing some of the research prior to the show that said it's a lot like being in the upside down in Stranger Things. If anybody who's watching this is familiar with Stranger Things, that your brain kind of trying to understand when and where things are, where you are, the spatial relations of the two, kind of there's a mismatch, right? At sometimes there's just kind of like a complete, your brain could think it's the complete opposite.
Yeah, and sometimes that's where I personally have to be really careful when I'm really tired, because I'll be walking somewhere, or I'll need to like follow a certain direction in order to complete a certain task. And it's like some wire in my brain will just like cross and forget that. Next thing I know, I'd be going in a different direction. So I've seen Stranger Things. I think that's a great analogy as well. I'd have to add, sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've it's something that a lot of us, I think, who have not had a diagnosis, right, could relate to, at least from a pop culture perspective. It's something where we see something, we think that's reality, but there's a different flip, there's a distortion there, there's a way that your brain just doesn't necessarily connect to things, or there's two separate realities in the way that it's perceived. There's a video I love to play from a young woman who posted she posted a YouTube video kind of describing her experience with that. I'm going to roll that right now, but we'll pull that up and we'll chat right after that.
Hi, my name's Abby. I'm a diagnosed dyspraxic, which means that I find it difficult to place myself in time and space. To put it another way, I have no spatial awareness, and I find it difficult to keep myself organised. My family first knew that I suffered with dyspraxia at 4. Teachers noticed that I bumped into other children and fell off chairs for no reason. I'd even trip over thin air. I was then officially diagnosed with dyspraxia at 11 by a paediatrician. Now at 18, I struggle with organising my thoughts and myself. I often find it difficult to organise my sentences. When out and about, I am very clumsy, falling over and smacking into walls and doors. Dyspraxia doesn't make me stupid. I don't let it stop me doing anything. I've sometimes been called names because of my dyspraxia, which makes me sad. Living with dyspraxia would be easier if I wasn't ridiculed and if more people understood the condition. It would also be nice if there was more help for people with dyspraxia, which is why we need to make more people aware of the condition.
Yeah, it's great seeing somebody with like the passion to say, yeah, we need to make more people aware of it, right? Make people aware of not only the condition, but it's something that in her case, in Abby's case, it was diagnosed or at least recognized at an early age. She said an age of 4. How was your experience, in terms of coming to getting a diagnosis? How young were you? And then what was the process to go through of actually receiving a pediatrician's diagnosis?
Well, I would have been about 4. I mean, that was a while now, so I'm going to do my best to remember some of the details. There might be some bits I don't remember, but I'll do my best. So I went through basically test after test after test, and it started because I fell down the stairs. When I first asked my parents about where it all started, it was because I had a really bad fall down a staircase, and it wasn't because I was intentionally trying to fall or I wasn't paying attention or something, but they noticed that I was learning everything from learning how to tie my shoes to everything like riding a bike to reading a little slower than some of my peers, and they didn't know what was up. So I started to see a series of patients and neurologists and things like that, did a lot of MRI scans. And after that, and MRI scans and blood tests and things like that, I got formally diagnosed. And then they had to, I'm based in Canada, so I don't know if this is a different label in school systems, but in Canada, we have what's called an IEP, which is individual education plan. So throughout most of school, I had to arrange that, and I had to have special accommodations for more time on tests and things like that, because of course my environment impacted things as well, and my ability to focus. And they had to have conversations with things like phys ed teachers, of course, because learning how to throw a ball and things like that, like I couldn't learn that as quickly as other children. And a little fun fact about that, my brother, who is now an officer in the Canadian military, I always associate this story with one of the things that might have driven him towards being a good officer. He's the reason I learned how to duck, is he taught me the hard way, which was he just basically we were at a beach and he threw a ball at me, and it was either I got out of the way or I didn't.
Yeah, you either ducked or covered, or you got hit in the head, one or the other.
Yeah.
So in that diagnosis, you said you had some blood work, you had MRIs. Was part of that going to a neurologist, or was it just a regular pediatrician? Like, do you remember in order to really receive that diagnosis, it sounds like there's a neurological disconnect. Almost seems like you would have a neurologist in play in somewhere in that.
Yeah, it was a combination of a neurologist and a pediatrician, but a big part of why I went through an unnecessary amount of tests was because I was one of the first generations of dyspraxics to be called a dyspraxic rather than just a clumsy child. Like I researched into this a bit, and before I was formally diagnosed, I was one of the first ones to be called having dyspraxia rather than just clumsy child syndrome. And mostly because they didn't think of it as a serious thing before then. They didn't really much. And so I feel like the testing process would be a little bit different now than it would have been back then, because they didn't really know like as much about it.
Right.
So it took a while for someone to be like, oh yeah, this is this thing we've been researching, and you've definitely got that.
Now, having grown up with it now, being diagnosed right around the time, or at least starting the diagnosis process about the time that you were 4, to being a grown woman now, having an adult life, an adult career where you're a copywriter and editor, what kind of how does it affect you today? We can't say clumsy adult syndrome, right?
Yeah.
But what are the common things, the ways that it impacts your life on a daily basis?
If I have to go to an unfamiliar location, I can't physically figure it out unless I see pictures on a map of like things that I would need to remember. Like, I still can't get west and north and all that right. And I have to, that's one of the key examples. Mm-hmm. And things like mentioned earlier, I really have to watch on the days when I'm tired, because just some motions would not be processed in my head as quickly, and I'd be prone to maybe like spilling things or whatever. But the big thing I have to watch is I have to have a very quiet environment. Otherwise, things around me are way too distracting. And really, that's a big part of what drew me to freelancing, because I had more freedom towards being able to choose my environment. And right. I didn't have to worry about being an environment where there was lots of stuff going on. And there was lots of people walking around and lots of idle chit chat and stuff like that. So I find freelancing really helped me from an environmental point of view.
Right.
But
As well as probably,
big thing
I would assume, like an organization perspective as well, right? Being able to have a set schedule that's your regiment, to be able to work in things that you can become familiar with. Even if you're going from client to client, you might have 3 or 4 people that you're working for. You can at least block out time or make things very predictable for yourself.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I absolutely do that. That's a big part of, I learned that the hard way when I first started freelancing, because I'm embarrassed to say this, but I missed my first deadline. And ever since, I realized I had to get my act together. And especially with this thing I live with, I have a lot of electronic calendars, and I only work during certain hours, and I have a lot of automated reminders set up to remind me when I have a meeting coming up, or I'm recording an episode of my podcast, or whatever it may be. If anything, it pushes me to be more organized. And because I had to learn language in a distinct way, it also drives my appreciation for language and my love of language. And I think people are drawn to my unique way of looking at language too. So that's the more positive side that I see of that.
Awesome. Well, I know our audience would be interested in hearing the 3 things, the biggest takeaways that you have of living with dyspraxia. What would you say is the first thing that you walk away with?
Well, that people aren't just the label. And I don't just mean this from the point of a disability, but I mean this from the point of anything, whether it might be that they have a specific regional accent, or they don't have very good sight, or whatever it may be. And it's a big part of why I always talk about this. That I don't like stories of people who have gone through disabilities where, even though they're good, well-intended, when they're framed as, well, this person is a big inspiration, even if it is something like they're just like some guy in a wheelchair did his taxes, whoop-de-doo, taxes, but he's in a wheelchair, so, or whatever that might be. And also in terms of, since so much of the writing I do is about marketing content, it also means too that I've never really been interested in the traditional marketing persona way of looking at things. I've always been a lot more interested in researching in more detail what people are interested in right now, and using the web as a really valuable tool to do that. So I think it's crossed over in that way, both with my work and also in terms of how I look at other people.
Okay, so definitely not one to put. Actually, it's one of the biggest things when I used to live in Los Angeles, and I gotta say, LA. People who are watching Los Angeles, I'm sorry, but I hated LA for one of 2 reasons. One, people were material. They were, things that you can use because you needed an introduction to a producer or something, and once you got that, you could discard that person like they were trash. But the second part is you were judged or given a label right off the bat, and that didn't matter if you were able-bodied or disabled, or if you had any type of, you fit into a bucket. And once you were labeled with that bucket, you couldn't get out of that bucket. And it meant that you were stuck in some sort of persona that a lot of people would judge you by. And I think that's an amazing takeaway, not only just from having lived with disability, but anybody should understand, like, you can label somebody, and as much as you're going to judge or not accept somebody because of a label, it could either be false, right? It could be something that's completely untrue, or it's going to taint your perception for anybody else that might come close to resembling another person, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm also an actor's daughter, so I feel like I can definitely relate to that whole world that you're describing.
Right.
because that's always where I think he always found frustration too, because he didn't want to be that label. He wanted to be just good at what he did, and that's what he wanted to do. And he didn't like that he was from, like, he's from England and he moved to Canada a while back, and like his big label was the fact that he's a British guy, that like
Right.
all he has to do is say one word and he opens his mouth and all people see is, oh, he's a British guy. Yeah.
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 Yeah. So let's get rid of the typecasting for life instead.
Yeah, definitely.
All right.
And
so
it makes,
first
it
one
makes for more valuable connections. I think more valuable connections with
absolutely.
people.
Absolutely. So first one, let's get rid of the labels. Let's embrace one another for who they are, not what we think they are. Second one, what do you have as our second takeaway?
Find humor in weakness. That's a big one. I think it keeps me sane. Like on the worst days, just being able to laugh at the fact that I can't get west and east right, and that I'm spilling things over, and that I can't remember like how long it will take to get from one place to the other. Just being able to find like the joke in that, and to be able to find something truly hilarious in that, just makes things a whole lot better. I'm a lot less likely to get frustrated. And I think it's a mentality that in general, I think in life and in work, if that can be applied, then everyone's better off.
Yeah. Speaking of humor, of navigational disorientation, I have a friend of mine whose mother, at the age of 45, she was diagnosed of having dyspraxia. And he used to tell us stories of how she knew how to get from home to work, and she knew how to get from home to the grocery store, but she didn't know how to get from work to the grocery store when they were a block apart. And she would laugh about it, and she knew that they were a block apart, but she still couldn't figure it out. Like, she had to drive all the way home, 5 miles home, to drive all the way back 5 miles back to get to the grocery store, even though she worked and the grocery store were that far apart. And she would just tell the story over and over so that people would laugh about it. It's understanding, or at least making a joke, and she accepted the fact of what she needed to do in order to get from point A to point B, because she was familiar with home base, home being where I'm always going to start from, and plotting out where she was going to go from there. But clumsiness, like, being able to laugh about clumsiness, being able to laugh about, for you, the navigation. Are there other things that you wish? It's not so much a laughing at, but a laughing with the person, right? So
yeah.
Your advice is more like being able to laugh at yourself, being able to internalize that, right?
Yeah, and less like absolutely. Less making fun of oneself, more being just finding the ridiculousness in the situation. I mean, my partner and I, a big part of what joined us too is he's lived with disabilities himself, and he has not one but two different ones he's lived with for a very long time, and even just he's had a prosthetic his whole life, and just being able to be able to say, wow, like, I have this prosthetic, and deal with it, and be able to say things like, look at this cool tattoo on there. There's this cool tattoo. Isn't that great, you guys? Like, things like that aren't like, poor me, I have this thing. They're more like finding something lighthearted about it.
Well, luckily for him, unlike me, I spent the hours under the gun actually getting a painful tattoo. I'm sure his probably didn't hurt quite as bad as mine. Well, so we're going to find the humor in the disability, and then how we can share that with others. What is your third takeaway that you want our audience to know?
Don't apologize about rest. I more wanted to mention that one because as a North American girl from big city, I grew up with this mentality of like rather than working to live, living to work. And it seemed like people would see a source of pride in working more time than their peers, not even because they were making more money, but because somehow they felt like that was something they had to do. And I mean, great. I mean, we all need to work and etc. But also, when I started to travel a bit, I met a lot of really great and bright Europeans who also found the value in the fact that there's more to life than just working all the time. And that if you need to take a morning off, you need to take a week off, you need to take a weekend off. There's nothing wrong with that. There's no shame in that, because I've realized that there are some days where everything will be going great and I'll be so in control and stuff like that. And there are some days where the total opposite will be happening and everything will just go wrong, and I will feel myself being a bit self-deprecating, and then I'll be like, you know what, maybe I do need that morning off. And I think through my life experiences living this thing, I just have learned to savor those times of rest and not feel like I need to explain it.
No, absolutely. And you're not alone, right? We're coming in an age, you're one of the first people to be living with the diagnosis, or at least, to grow up in a diagnosis. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people who have been since either diagnosed with dyspraxia, understand the signs and symptoms, and may need to go see their own neurologist or somebody to get a diagnosis. But, people like Daniel Radcliffe, Cara Delevingne, I can never say her last name.
Oh, I don't know her, so I'm afraid I can't be very helpful.
It's Cara Delevingne, Delevigne, Delevingne. She played the Enchantress in the movie with one of the Marvel movies or DC Comics movies. Mm-hmm. But there are famous people that live with it. Harry Potter. You'd think that Harry Potter was just a clumsy kid at Hogwarts, but no. Daniel Radcliffe growing up and even as into his adult, there are many times that he's even talked about having to take a rest. I need a break during shooting. This is really intense. I need to calm down and center my mind so that we can move forward. Can you give me a few to do that? But you're right.
I read too that that's a big part of what drew him towards being an actor too, the flexibility of being able to say those things. And I can really relate to that too.
Yeah. And it's something, whether it's a motor disability or, an amputation or things where there's physical limitations, but there's also the mental limitations. Like how much can your brain process, and having to connect new dots, or, going to someplace where you're unfamiliar, I need to take a while to become familiar with this place so that I can be more relaxed in company of others or whatever you need to do. But not being afraid to speak up when that happens, when the anxiety comes on or the fear comes on or anything comes on as a result of that newness, right?
Yeah, that part took me a lot of time. Other people used to have to advocate for me, but as I grew older and it became more of a necessity of having to say, you know what, I have this thing and here's how you can help me, I found myself having to speak up and just getting involved. Like I often contribute to the Dyspraxia US and UK groups because there's always a lot of moms and dads who are like, my kid has dyspraxia and I don't know what to tell other teachers and stuff like that. And I think what inspires me to keep being really open about it is that I realize there are other people out there that are not really sure what to do, or people who are loved ones of people that are going through dyspraxia who don't know what to do. And just being able to share my experience, I find always just makes such a huge difference.
So, aside from sharing your own experience here on this show, where can people find resources? You mentioned there's some forums and support groups, but what are the real resources that parents or people living with a diagnosis can turn to find some help and some guidance?
I think Dyspraxia USA's Facebook groups are valuable. The guy who's the founder of the UK one, he's dyspraxia himself. And so he makes a point of being really heavily involved in it, encouraging people to be really heavily involved. And yeah, the best places to look are also, there is very independent Twitter community for dyspraxia conversations as well, where people can reach out.
Awesome.
I don't remember the name of it, but just look it up.
Yeah.
Look up dyspraxia and it should be there.
Well, I'm sure a friend, called Google is always helpful. And if anybody needs to know how to spell it, it is in the description here. But we'll make sure to also post some of the links in the comment sections below. So if you have any questions or need specific support groups or places to turn to, we'll make sure to provide those links below. Rosemary Richings, you are a copywriter editor in Toronto. How do people get a hold of you if they want to find you?
Well, through my website, rosemaryricings.com, just my first name and last name, all one word, no caps. And I also have a podcast called People Behind the Business and a blog called rosiewritingspace.com. And those are the best starting points, really.
Awesome. Thank you again for being a part of the show. I appreciate you not only educating us about dyspraxia, but also, giving us a little glimpse into what it's like to live with it and your condition. Thank you for being open enough to share that with all of us today.
Yeah, it's been great.
Alrighty. If anybody else has any questions or comments, please feel free to note them below here in the show. And of course, we will make sure that all of the resources will be posted online. Again, thanks to Rosemary. This has been the 3 Things I've Learned podcast, 3 things I've learned about living with a disability. Tune in next time. We will have our next show next week, Thursday at 1 p.m. We have Chris Wessling who will be joining us to talk about 3 things he's learned about living on a nuclear submarine. So I think that's going to be interesting and not so much down Periscope, although I think a lot of people will be interested in that one. Until next week, we will see you all again soon.